People want to work or to be led by people who are authentic. We all want to be authentic. We think about what it means to be human. We all want to be human as God wants us to be human. And when you work for someone who is more authentically human, you are naturally attracted to them because that is what you want to become. And that can motivate you. The job itself is the way to live out that motivation to become more authentic, to be more like this leader that's guiding you. You have to understand yourself and who you are and be comfortable with yourself and who you are. So that way you're vulnerable. This vulnerability in leadership is part of being authentic. And that's naturally attractive to people. And I think that can motivate people in many cases, no matter what the job is. I mean, some people you just can't motivate no matter what. But
that's true.
For many people, yeah.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Founders Podcast. I'm your host, Silas Mayer. At Catholic Founders, we believe that entrepreneurship in its truest form is a divine calling, meaning that only Christians can answer this call to the fullest extent possible. And that's what we are exploring on this podcast, as well as what we do in our Tuesday Saintly CEO newsletter, where we condense some of the core things that we learned from the podcast into much more digestible, quick reads. So if this is your first time here, thank you so much for tuning in. Today, we have a little bit of a different episode. Our guest is Joe Markey. He's not a business owner, nor has he been. In fact, he actually worked his entire career in finance, primarily for one company, but he had an interest in theology and religion, and he actually studied that at one point kind of in the middle of his career, but also, again, just after he retired, he decided to go back and study theology. So he has a relatively interesting perspective because he was exposed to all of the kind of so-called top of the line business best practices when it comes to managing people and all that. And where we would usually apply the faith to how you run your business, he has an interesting way of saying, hey, what if we applied the best business practices to how we run or how we grow in our spiritual life? So it's a relatively interesting way to flip the kind of the equation. I really enjoy this conversation. I'm pretty sure you will too. It is, again, he's not a business owner, but he has a lot of very interesting insights. Oscar and I, we both were talking about after the conversation, after it was done recording, how much we enjoyed it. So I'm pretty sure you will as well. And before we start, a quick thank you to our sponsors that make this show possible. We have Our Father Constructors and Associates, your church-related project manager. Go to ourfather.us to learn more. And we have Monument Advisors, sophisticated wealth advisors for Catholic business owners who want access to all asset types. The key word there being all asset types. Access, access, access. Go to monumentadvisors.com. And finally, I do need to mention, if you're a Catholic and you believe that you have that entrepreneurial gene, you're called to build something, whether you're building right now or you're called to start something, I really want to encourage you to join the Catholic Founders Guild. What we're doing is about a lot more than entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship, most people think of as here's, a gift that you have to make money. Entrepreneurship is really being a co-creator with God, meaning it's about a lot more than just making money. It's about integrating the way that God has built creation into the way that you run your business, putting things in the proper order, in the proper place, so you can use that agency, that co-creative ability that he gave you to really transform the world around us, to make it in line with the way God is calling. So there's a lot more to it than just, a community of Catholic entrepreneurs. We're really trying to form each other, to help each other build up our businesses, and to understand how can we fully step into that calling of what it means to be a high agency person who's called to build things in the world. So if you're interested in joining a group of people like that, join the Catholic Founders Guild today. It's $100 a year. So regardless if you're just starting or you're running a $100 million a year business, anybody can afford to join it. All you have to do is go to join.catholicfounders.com to learn more, and the links to join are there as well. All right, without any further delay, enjoy today's episode. All right, welcome to the podcast, Joe. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Silas. It's great to be here with you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, we're super excited for this. So where are you calling from, by the way, again?
So I'm in Middletown, Rhode Island, which most people may know where Newport, Rhode Island is. So I'm right next door.
Nice. I've been to Rhode Island briefly, I think. I want to say it's Providence?
Providence is about
St. Mary's.
Yes. Providence is about a half hour north of here. Newport is at its best this time of year. It's just beautiful. It's a great place to be.
Yeah, I love that, man. A lot of people I talk about, moving to Nashville, and they're like, man, why would you do that? There's no ocean nearby. And I was like, well, I don't really care. I didn't grow up by the ocean, so it's like it doesn't matter to me. I grew up in the woods.
Well, I'm sure Nashville has its advantages in the winter.
Yes, it definitely does. Being from Wisconsin, I would know. But anyways, so I'm excited for this. I want to preface this a little bit for people listening. Obviously, I'll give an intro before the show starts, but you are, our guest today is not necessarily a traditional business owner, but has a lot of experience, I believe, primarily in the banking world, and has also, since, you correct me if I got any of this wrong, but since retiring, has actually decided to study theology, which is quite a fascinating turn of career, and has a number of perspectives on virtue in business and how maybe, I guess you could say, how the virtues that are typical in business can actually be applied to our spiritual life in order to help us grow in our spiritual life. Is that would you say that that's a fair characterization?
Yeah, very good. That is a fair characterization. And, you're absolutely right. And I think we're going to get into this a little bit in the topics that we cover. But, the virtue, the ethics, the behaviors that are necessary to be successful in business reflect who we are as humans, as relational beings. And to be successful in business, you need to possess a lot and embody a lot of these characteristics, whether you are a Christian or a Catholic or whatever your faith tradition is. The business world, the market requires us to embody a lot of these characteristics and virtues in dealing with others.
Agreed, man. Well, let's do this. So before we get too far into it, give us a quick background on yourself. Who are you? What's like a little bit of your backstory, and then maybe the brief kind of story of your career.
Sure. So I grew up in Ridgefield, Connecticut, which is about an hour north of New York City. I grew up as one of 11 children, the middle one, number 6. And the reason why I mention that is because if you look back over history, there are many great mediators throughout history who were the middle child, whether it's one of 11 or one of 3. So I grew up, went to University of Connecticut, graduated. When I graduated in 1983, you can probably guess my age. I've been around for a while. It was a difficult economy, and I needed to go to work. I ended up in banking because they offered me an opportunity. It wasn't like I set out to be a banker. I just said I needed a job. I had to pay rent, etc. And I ended up in banking. And that's where I remained for my entire career. There were some notable moments in that journey, which is all of about 40 years. About halfway through it, after getting married and having 2 young boys, I decided to go back to school at night, part-time, studying religion. And this was at St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers, New York. So this was part-time, at night, didn't conflict with work. And it instilled in me sort of a formalization or a language to go along with what I felt I was seeing in the marketplace of business. And I took with me that language and those memories of those courses. They were excellent professors. And seeing a lot of these characteristics of leaders of corporations that I was working with and how they embodied these traditions, these religious values, whether or not they were religious or not. And in many cases, I didn't know what their religious tradition was or how active they were in their current faiths. And just for the listener, in banking, I was in corporate and investment banking. So my job was really to partner with senior leadership and owners of companies, understand their strategic objectives, and help them get the capital they needed to execute on those strategic objectives, whether it's different kinds of debt, equity, public, private, whatever it might be, really to be a strategic advisor to these companies. So I really got to know some of these business owners and executive teams very well over the years, and some of them were, personal relationships that I really benefited from. It was a wonderful career.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Now, there's a couple of things there. I want to know, just to clarify, when did you start going to night school? You said you started doing that while you were in banking. What was that towards the end of your career, or was that more like in the middle?
This was in the middle, so that was probably 20 years ago. However, when I retired from banking, I then went back full-time studying theology at Boston College in Boston, in Chestnut Hill. And I began that in 2023. So I received a master's in theological studies last December, actually graduated this May. And that was a wonderful experience. It was great to go back to school at this age and be there with a lot of younger people, some older, some younger. There were some other people like me that had long careers that wanted a career change. I loved it. And it was a fascinating experience for a lot of reasons. But I entered there thinking that I was a bit of an outcast, like a wolf in sheep's clothing almost, where I was kind of looked upon as, here's this retired executive coming back to school. What is he looking to get out of this? What I realized in that journey was that what I was looking for in the validation in going back to study theology was right in front of me in the marketplace the whole time. Mm-hmm. And again, this goes to the idea that people, to be successful in business, need to embody and live out these values that allow them to be successful. You have to have integrity. You have to be honest for the most part. You need to be aware of yourself, EQ, right? You need to be compassionate. You need to show empathy. You need to be a good communicator. You need to be able to deal with change. As a professional owning a business, change is constant. You have to be aware of what's going on around you and how are you going to respond to it. And also investing in your community, putting money back to work in the community and supporting your major stakeholders, whether it's the community, your other owners, might be shareholders, your employees, your clients, etc. All of those values came together, and I saw it so consistently over the years. As a banker, you're usually, for the most part, dealing with successful companies, because if you're not going to be a banker for very long. So, dealing with these successful leadership teams and business owners, I saw it firsthand, and it always impressed me. And there wasn't, and usually wasn't, a theological language that went along with it. But just the idea of empathy, for example, great business leaders, they care for their employees. They try to take care of them. And it's not just for selfish reasons. Of course, taking care of your employees helps your business because you need them to run the business. But it also reflects what it means to be human and to be charitable. The two go hand in hand. Good business and good religion go hand in hand. And too often in our culture, we separate the two. We see, good religion and good business as separate, two different worlds, like secular and sacred. But they're not. They go together. And I think my perspective is a little unique because I've done both. I've been out in the marketplace for decades, and then I've also studied theology, and I'm also, I have a deep faith as well. So, it's interesting. And I feel privileged that I was able to do that, go back to school at this stage of my life.
Yeah. I want to go back to the school part in a second, but you mentioned just now that I think you said good business and good religion go hand in hand. I'm curious, specifically maybe on the example of treating your employees with empathy and treating them well because it's the right thing to do. I'm just kind of curious to get more nuanced perspective on this. Like, I have seen that people can sometimes do these things because they know it's the right thing to do in business, and they do it for the sake of the business rather than for the sake of the human, because they know that the human deserves respect. And I just want to know if you had any personal experiences where you could see this, where, you could tell that somebody was, they were basically being performative to do it, but deep down they didn't really believe it. Or maybe that's what they did for a period of time, and then eventually started to realize that actually this is the right thing to do, and they had maybe a conversion of heart. Do you have any particular stories around that?
Yes, but of course, what you're pointing out is a reality, right? Whether it's performative or real, there's false modesty and whatnot. So yeah, that's the tension, the conflict that's always there. But I'll give you an example, and it's not necessarily specific to a person, but it's something you see. You hire somebody, you put them in a job, 6 months later, they're not doing well at the job. You say to yourself as a manager, as a leader, how can I help them be better in this job? And you work with them and you give them guidance. 6 months later, another review, they're still not doing well. You have empathy for this person. You have compassion. And there's a difference between compassion and empathy. So we'll say we have compassion. And you want them to do well, but they're not doing well. Do you have to let them go? Do you have to find another assignment for them? You have to do what's right for the business. And you may say, well, the right thing to do is to keep them employed. They're a mother or a father of a family. They need employment. But on the other hand, are you doing them a disservice by keeping them on in a position that they're not well suited for? Like if you hired somebody into sales, but they're just not a good salesperson. They don't have the ability, no matter how much you work with them. Eventually, you may say, look, I have compassion, but I'm not doing you any favors by keeping you around in this role. I'm going to tell you, you're not suited for this role, and you need to find something else. And that can be painful for both people. But in the long run, that employee may be better off. It could be a very important lesson for them that could help them later in life to not take another sales job, for example. But obviously, there could be many other jobs we're talking about here.
We had Flip Howard on the podcast a while back, and he talked something similar, right? It's like if somebody's not flourishing in the role, find the right thing. And I wonder, there's something we'll come back to, but it is worth noting that as the leader of the business and as the person the employees report to, whether you're the owner of the business or just a manager in your team, there is something specific that you need to be aware of on helping them engage properly and helping them figure out what makes them tick, so that they can be in the right space. Because if they're just doing something because it's like going to college for something that your parents told you to go for, and you really ultimately don't like doing it, you're not going to be engaged as much. Whereas most people who are successful, who are very passionate about the thing that they're in, they become successful because they're passionate, right? And they will make money usually along the way too. So I want to, on the same idea, I want to talk about motivation. So maybe you can bring this into your own story if you'd like, but employees sometimes lack motivation because, a lot of people, if they put their mind to something, they can really, become good at something. But if they lack the motivation to do so, it's very hard to do that. So, like, do you believe that there's a lot of, in your experience managing people, is there a way to help people uncover their own motivation and then tie it to the thing at hand? Or is it something that is only like they either are or they aren't? I'm just curious, like, is there some kind of like diamond to be uncovered for these employees that you can show them, like, this is truly what matters to you? Hey everybody, here's a quick word about our sponsors. Our Father Constructors and Associates is a Catholic-owned construction and project management firm. If you're involved in a diocese, parish, school, or religious community, and you've got a building project on the horizon, you need to talk to Our Father Construction. They will help you fund it, build it, execute it, and make sure that the momentum keeps going from concept all the way through to completion. They should be your go-to construction project manager. They will choose the right architects, designers, and contractors, and they'll protect your budget, oftentimes finding you savings where you didn't even know they existed. And, of course, making sure that what gets built actually serves the church for generations because they genuinely care. They structure and manage projects all the way from $1 to $45 million. To learn more, reach out to ourfather.us or email Christian directly. And I can speak personally in saying, I know Christian, I've known him for a while, he's a very good friend of mine, he's somebody that I would trust with my life and my family. So reach out to Christian, that's Christian at ourfather.us if you have a project on the horizon and you want to make sure it gets done right. These guys will take care of you and they'll make sure everything turns out right and all for the glory of God. And tell them Silas sent you. Hey everyone, quick interruption to tell you about our sponsor, Monument Advisors. Tom Rooney and Matthew Molman aren't just financial advisors, they're Catholic business owners themselves. And they think about money the way we do, as something entrusted to us by God, meant to be stewarded, not accumulated. They work with Catholic entrepreneurs on everything, from building an investment plan around your values and family, to figuring out whether a retirement business plan makes sense. Most interestingly, they have access to opportunities in the private markets, which most advisors never even bring up. And for any of you who are currently Catholic Founders Guild members, here's a question. When's the last time that you took a hard look at the personal and family risks that you have left by the wayside, especially as a business owner? Tom and Matthew want to extend an invitation for an estate health check with their team. It's kind of like an annual physical, but in this case, there's no cold hands and awkwardness in the waiting room. This check is an easy way to uncover gaps in your overall financial picture and then take action to establish foundational estate documents that address those you care for. If you're married, your spouse will thank you. There's a link to book a call with them in the description. Tell them that Catholic Founders sent you.
Yeah, yes, very much so, and I think that's a characteristic of great leaders. And I'm gonna put it in the context of authenticity. People want to work or to be led by people who are authentic. And I think today we use the term genuine. I like this person because at least I know what they're saying. They're saying what they mean, right? I might not agree with them, but I like what they're saying. They're honest. They're transparent. That's being genuine. Being authentic goes deeper. It means being authentically human, what it means to be human, not just saying being transparent about what you believe, but believing in the things that represent what it means to be human. All those things we talked about, compassion, communicative, inclusiveness, etc., interpersonal awareness. People who are not motivated many times become motivated when they work for someone who is authentic. We all want to be authentic. We think about what it means to be human. We all want to be human as God wants us to be human. And when you work for someone who is more authentically human, you are naturally attracted to them because that is what you want to become. And that can motivate you. And that's where a great leader comes in. The job itself is the way to live out that motivation to become more authentic, to be more like this leader that's guiding you. And I think that's where great leadership comes in. And that requires you have to understand yourself and who you are before you can do that. And be comfortable with yourself and who you are. So that way you're vulnerable. This vulnerability in leadership is part of being authentic. And that's naturally attractive to people. And I think that can motivate people in many cases, no matter what the job is. I mean, some people you just can't motivate no matter what. But
That's true.
For many people, yeah.
Well, for you though, I want to understand your specific, because you said you didn't intentionally necessarily get into banking. It was just based on the economy and everything, that's where you found an opportunity. Were you naturally motivated just to work hard regardless at the beginning, or did you have good bosses who brought that out in you?
Yeah, I was fortunate to have good bosses over the years. I mean, I did, I admit it. Many of my bosses motivated me, but they also, they give you latitude, they give you a lot of rope. You can survive or not, sink or swim. And I think that's what good bosses do also. They trust you, they give you trust. And when you get trust, that becomes something valuable that you don't want to give up. So you want to use that trust to show that it wasn't misplaced when they gave it to you. So yeah, I had good bosses over the years, for the most part. I had bad ones too. Sometimes I learned more from the bad ones than from the good ones.
Yeah, I think it's true. I usually advise early career people, given that I work in recruiting, that the most important thing you choose in your first job is that you choose the right person to work for, because the work itself is, it matters to an extent, but having a really good boss versus like a mediocre boss is going to be way different in terms of like the speed that you get your career off to. Yeah, the reason I was partially asking this is because I was wondering, like, what motivated somebody like you who had this like long career in one place to study religion a little bit in the middle and then decide afterwards to go back into theology? Do you think that deep down, if you had a choice early on, like when you had just started your career, if you didn't have to go into banking, that you would have done something else? Like, is there something for you intrinsically that you've uncovered over the years that's like your underlying motivator?
Well, growing up in a family as large as mine, 13 people, including my parents. By the way, my 97-year-old mother, she's still alive. I was always a people person. So a career in something that required me to be people-facing suited me.
Mm-hmm.
So sales, but corporate and investment banking is a form of sales. It's a consulting role, but it requires, certain skills and whatnot, understanding of the markets. But you still have to interact with people on a personal level and be able to gain their trust. And that is one of the most valuable things that people in a consulting role do. They gain people's trust. And you have to do that by showing them you understand what they're doing, asking the right questions, intellectual curiosity, and then, of course, executing when they ask you to execute. The other thing is, when you're in a sales role or in a consulting role or a banking role, as I was, it's like baseball. You're pitching ideas. If you're hitting 300, you're hitting pretty good. So you got to be able to deal with rejection a lot and be resilient. Resiliency is so important. You work really hard on an opportunity, you work on a relationship, takes you years, and then you lose it to somebody else, or you don't get as much of the transaction as you wanted to. So you bounce back. Sure, you're disappointed, you feel it, it's painful, but you have to be resilient. And I think that resiliency is another great leadership quality. I have two boys. They're both in their 30s. They're professionals, fairly successful. And I can see their disappointment at times in their career. I can also see their successes. And I tell them, your leadership team is looking at you when you have a disappointment in your job, whatever it is. And they're looking at you to see how you react. And sometimes they're looking more to see how you deal with disappointment than how you deal with success. Because it's easy to deal with success. It's harder to deal with failure. And sometimes more of your character is revealed in the failures. And I think that's where this idea of resiliency is so incredibly important for leaders. And that requires an optimism. And that optimism requires that you understand who you are. And many times that's where your faith comes in. You can see a bigger picture so that the disappointments don't drag you down too much. You've got grace, you've got Christ, you've got a relationship there that can really elevate you sometimes when you need it most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's helpful. I'd be curious to hear your perspective. I've been thinking about this a lot, this idea of hope and how, the virtue of hope. Well, somebody I think pointed out, I'm trying to remember his name. I forget his name at the moment, but he gave a talk about how you can't invest or investing itself, is a form of hope. Like, it's a form of trusting in the future, that the future is going to be better than the present. And I'm just kind of curious your perspective on hope in the workplace, especially during, like, let's say, longer periods of challenge where it's like, man, it has been a terrible quarter or it's been a terrible year. Like, how do you have hope in those cases rather than kind of spiraling inwards and saying, oh, how am I going to sort this out? How am I going to fix this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the answer to that many times depends on the individual and how they deal with it. But I think the best people deal with it by mustering the strength to maintain that hope, but recognizing that whatever your mission is, understanding what the bigger mission is, not only of your business, but what you, your family, your relationships are trying to achieve. But if you believe in yourself and make that commitment and in your mission, understanding what the mission is. Do you have like a mission statement for your company? Do you believe in it? And seeing it and pursuing it, I think, is really important. having a big picture. Yeah, this is disappointing. Sometimes when times get really tough at work or you have a bad stretch, and in banking, we certainly have our cycles where we go through difficult periods. I think about the Israelites when they were slaves, right, in Egypt. They prayed, they prayed, they prayed. They were there so long before their prayers were answered. Sometimes you got to hang in there, and you got to have hope, and you got to wait for the right person, the right opportunity to surface. And it can be difficult. But when you think you have it bad and times are tough, think about other people that have had it really tough for so much longer. And then that kind of relativizes it and makes it more manageable.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think it's very easy to get kind of like wrapped up in your own negative circumstances. But if you take even just a minute to look around you, you probably have a lot of people you know somewhat intimately who have really negative circumstances, and it's easy to become much more grateful for what you have and to persevere. So I also always wonder, I don't really want to go down this topic too much today, but I do oftentimes wonder about the nature of how God is trying to speak to us individually through the trials of work, whether that's, running a business or just as an employee. I think that there's something, you don't want to like over spiritualize everything, but I do believe that there's always lessons to be had in the way that life is going around us for what we're uniquely called to try to understand more about God, about his mercy, or whatever it is specifically for us in that moment. So for anybody in those moments, definitely consider that. So, I want to know your perspective on the younger generation and how there's a lot of people who are very, I guess you could say, suspicious of the business world, right? Specifically right now, I used to live in New York City, so I'm kind of following what's going on with the new mayor, this rise of democratic socialism. And why do you think that people are, especially young people, are so skeptical of the business world?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. And I, too, am not going to tread into New York politics or really democratic socialism because it's a hot topic and I'm not sure I fully understand it. But wealth disparity is a challenge at this time in our culture. Wealth disparity has always been part of history. It's always been part of our country. I think there were other times in our history, maybe during the Gilded Age, when the wealth disparity in the U.S. may have even been higher or greater than it is now. But, when you have so many billionaires now, for example, where, a millionaire used to mean something. And then there's people who are struggling, this question of affordability. And this resentment, rises because they're working so hard, they're trying to make ends meet, and they can't do it. And they want somebody to do something for them about it. I think where the problem arises is that the government is not the answer. The government is the problem. It's not the answer. It's not the solution. And I think my whole life, I have been opposed to communism. It's just some kind of an idea that resonated with me in a wrong way from when I was very young. And it might have been John Paul II. And I can remember when Centesimus Annus came out, they used to have this middle column in the Wall Street Journal when you got the hard copy, and the middle column was all about Centesimus Annus. And I remember reading it and saying, man, this was so inspiring. And, not to get into the politics or the political philosophy of communism, but, to me, communism or socialism puts the government at the center of our lives, where Christianity, Catholicism puts the individual at the center of our lives. The Imago Dei, the respect for the individual. And to me, that's the theological difference. And that's why I find this democratic socialism so dangerous. It's easy to reach for. I also saw some of this when I was at school at Boston College. A lot of people there, we always ask each other, what are you studying? What's your focus? And a lot of people would say, well, liberation theology. It was very attractive. And after a while, I started to understand what liberation theology meant to them. And, a lot of these people would, probably fit very nicely in the Democratic Socialist Party of America, right? They wanted change. They saw business, people who were successful, as corrupt. Of course, these are people that had no experience in the marketplace. They didn't know what it took to be successful in business because they never experienced it themselves. They didn't have the experience I had. The dean and the professors really encouraged me to bring my experiences into the classroom and to talk about it openly because my experience was quite a bit different than what they had experienced. So I did it in a delicate fashion, without, hurting anybody's feelings. I was always respectful. Of course, you're in an academic environment where you have to, encourage exchange of ideas, which I still miss. So many times today in conversations, we talk in sound bites. It's nice to be in a long form podcast, for example, where you can express your ideas a little bit more. But I did see that in studying theology. And this is one of the top theology programs in the world. So if this is what the student body is feeling at that level, these are future ministers, priests, religious, not-for-profit leaders, et cetera. that take that, I'm going to call it liberation theology idea, into their own marketplaces. I guess at the root cause of, how they're feeling is concern for the marginalized. And I understand that, and I share that concern deeply as well. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of a difference of opinion of what the solution is.
If you're a Catholic business owner, you should not be building alone. Join the Catholic Founders Guild at catholicfounders.com/subscribe. For $10 a month, you can join a group of Catholic founders who are dedicated to bringing the culture back to God. Don't build alone. Join the Catholic Founders Guild today. Hey there, quick interruption. Before we get back to our guest, let's talk about stewardship. A lot of the capital allocators and investors who listen to this show tell me that they want to put their capital to work supporting other Catholic businesses. The problem is, finding those builders has always been incredibly difficult. That is why we launched a dedicated investor newsletter over at catholicinvestors.co or catholicdealflow.com if that's easier to remember. When you subscribe, you aren't signing up for a fund, an investment platform, or any kind of advisory service. It's simple. We publish a regular newsletter cycle that shares strictly factual, unhyped business overviews and metrics from active Catholic-led ventures that are looking for capital. There are no sales pitches, no transaction fees. It is a passive digital bulletin board delivered straight to your inbox so you can do your own independent vetting. If you want to see who is building in the ecosystem and seeking capital, go to catholicdealflow.com and join the newsletter list today. All right, back to the show. For what it's worth, I'm curious to get your thoughts on, this is my perspective on it generally, and again, this is still a work in progress, but I believe that even in the ages past when there was perhaps more economic disparity between the haves and have-nots, the people who had the money, let's take Rockefeller, for example, right? I think Rockefeller had this kind of like, I don't know the word to use, but he believed that God had ordained him to become wealthy, to take care of people, and he didn't really pay good wages, right? So he paid okay wages, but it's not like he was out there like sacrificing margin. Like he was ruthless, right? Reducing the number of solder, like points on the barrel just to get it to the point where it's the absolute cheapest, right? But at the same time, there was a sort of public good in the back of their mind, right? These people like Rockefeller, they built libraries, they did many different things for the public, and they had a sense of responsibility that they were called to be stewards. Maybe they didn't take that to the fullness of what they should have, what they could have, but they did something of that nature. And my perspective is that either it could be just a misconception or like a misperspective of people, but it seems as though many of our tech billionaire elite today do not see that. Like they don't view themselves as responsible for that, right? They view themselves as maybe like a new conquerors of sorts, right? Where they're taking a lot, and when things get tough, they exit. Like look at California, right? A lot of people are exiting California after it's getting tough, and they're being kind of like, let's call it persecution, so to speak, for these like tech elite. Instead of engaging and saying, you know what, why don't we actually deal with what's going on here, deal with the thing that we're not familiar with, which is bureaucracy and tediousness of policymaking, et cetera, and let's change something locally. There's like, hey, we're out. And eventually, if things get bad enough, they might go to Dubai or something, right, where they can just like ignore the problem. So I'm kind of curious your take on this, like the lack of sense of responsibility and helping out the community, and more of an extractive mindset. Do you think that is part of it, and do you think that I'm even accurate in observing that?
You're accurate. With wealth comes moral hazard, for sure. The arrogance, the ego, the master of the universe syndrome, that goes along with it. And I think that self-centeredness is part of the risk of success. They go hand in hand. So yeah, for sure. There is an elite, particularly in Silicon Valley. And I think when we talk about democratic socialism in America, a lot of it's aimed at that group as a stereotype. But to your point, Rockefeller gave back a lot of money. He did a lot of good things. And there's a lot of business leaders out there that do a lot of good as well. And it's, it depends on the individual, it depends on the company and what they're doing and how they give back. But for sure, there is corruption that goes along with, but communism has its corruption too. I hate to go back to communism, but both systems are subject to it. But at the end of the day, you have to have an economic pie that's big enough to take care of the marginalized. So how do you grow that economic pie? And you do it by growing great businesses, by being smart business people, by being competitive, by coming up with new ideas, by making your company more efficient. That sounds ruthless, but it's not. You still have to treat people with integrity and respect to get there. Otherwise, you're not going to be in business for very long. So, where do those resources, that come to take care of the marginalized come from? We expand the economic pie by being, American exceptionalism. I have a funny anecdote. Margaret Thatcher, we all know who she was, and she was a conservative. And one time she said, look, she was trying to, reduce government intervention. She was doing battle with the unions, taxation, et cetera. She said, look, the Good Samaritan couldn't have been the Good Samaritan if he didn't have some money. And, it's a simple story, but it makes a lot of sense. If he didn't have the money to pay the innkeeper, right, casually, say, care for this person, the money, the care, it has to come from somewhere. And this country, you see the discrepancy in income and wealth. It's there for sure. And it's very pronounced right now. And I think it's being stretched. And that's why you see so many people that are angry about it. But, there's a lot of good people out there that are doing great things as well. If I can make one more comment here on this topic, because it's near and dear to my heart. Jamie Dimon, right? The ultimate finance bro, right? He's being interviewed several years ago after the bankruptcy of Detroit. And he's at a press conference because JP Morgan just made a $200 million commitment to the city, to invest in the community, to help ownership, jobs, etc. And one of the reporters cynically said, well, aren't you just investing in Detroit because you have a lot of branches, mortgage business, etc. here? And Jamie Dimon just immediately shot back and said, the two are not mutually exclusive. We're helping our community. When the community thrives, when we thrive, we all thrive together. This idea of separating the two, you're just investing because it helps your business. No, we help each other.
Yeah, this is very fascinating because what it is ultimately in that case is there's buy-in from, in this case, JP Morgan, right? They have reason to be involved in the area because they have some stake in the ground, basically, right? And if they didn't, which is what happens, I think, a lot of times in the private equity world right now, is where you see people investing in businesses or doing roll-ups in areas where they have no involvement, or they're building apartment complexes where they have no involvement. They don't live there. They don't see how ugly they are. They're not involved in the space. So yes, you could, that reporter can be cynical towards him, but because they had a stake in the ground, they had some kind of local involvement that allowed them to say, we have to do something about this, right? So even if they were only doing it for the sake of preservation, there's a reason why it's good to have that local engagement. And I think that, there's a lot of, we could go in a wholly different direction here, but I think that is something worth really people kind of contemplating is how do you make sure that wherever you are doing business, there is some way that you are involved so that you understand the community. We just did a podcast recently with this couple who they run a company called Moser Made. Their last name's Moser. They make honey, they have a sawmill, and they do some like custom woodworking stuff. And they started doing these dinners for their community where they host like farm to table dinners. And the only reason they knew that was interesting to the community was because they were out there in the community talking to people and understanding like, hey, what do you guys, what do you wish that we had? And they all wish that they had more community. So they brought these families together and they had this amazing, dinner. That is basically product development, right? It's understanding your local community. So it's something worth kind of keeping in the back of our minds.
You're touching on a bigger topic here, which we don't have to pursue, but the whole idea of globalization and multinational corporations doing business all the way around the world. How do you remain connected to those local communities around the world? Whereas Walmart sourcing its T-shirts from? So yeah, it's a difficult topic for sure. But I agree with you.
It is challenging, but it's also. It is kind of related. I wanted to bring this example up because I forgot to in the Rockefeller situation was during the Great Depression. I think it was primarily led by his son, but they ended up deciding to build Rockefeller Center and to employ so many people because there was no jobs. They basically, you could say they probably ended up making money, obviously in the end, but they were putting out of pocket to employ people to prevent like kind of mob mentality on the streets. And they built what is now like one of the most like staple places and iconic places in all of New York City, right? And they had that sense of, okay, it's a tough time now. It's time for us to use our surplus to give back because it's for the greater good of our country. Maybe it was self-preservation, who cares? But at the end of the day, they recognized what they had to do, which was to stay and help rather than to exit, right? And this is what I wonder if this is going to happen right now with some of the backlash, if some of these elite will recognize that it's time for us to deploy our surplus back into the communities in a way where, yeah, we may not be making the most ROI, but we're going to do it. And the same thing is true, like globalization. Yes, you could take your work offshore in some cases, like if you need to. But if you can afford to do it locally, especially in times like these, maybe you should, right? Maybe you should employ people locally. I'm not going to, I got to point out that I hire all of my employees overseas because we're trying to do recruiting for about half the price or less as other firms in order to be competitive for a particular startup class. So, I'm one to talk, but the point is, I do think that there's some amount of being observant about that component. So,
But you're offering your employees overseas good jobs.
yeah, I definitely am. You could ask them. I think they would agree. Very good. So now, one thing I wanted to ask you about is this is kind of the core theme that you like to talk about, and I want to make sure we get back to this, which is applying the virtue of business to your spiritual life. So I just want you to unpack this a little bit more and maybe give a couple like really tactical examples that things that are common practice in the business world, in entrepreneurship, how we can take those same virtues, if you will, whether they're natural or supernatural virtues, and apply them to our spiritual life and growing our faith.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so over the many years working with so many talented and smart leadership teams, I would see them operating and executing in a way that required them, and they did it quite naturally, which is why they were successful. A lot of these virtues that we extol as Catholics, as Christians, whether they were Catholic or Christian or not. So many of them, when they found out that I was studying religion part-time earlier in my career, some of them would open up. But religion is largely taboo in the boardroom, particularly if you're a public company. So I'm going to take, for an example, modern leadership science industry, which is like a $40 billion industry, right? And I would go through my leadership training, and they would bring in these leadership, I call them high priests of capitalism, right? And they would talk about what it means to be a great leader. And a lot of them would talk about EQ, right? EQ versus IQ, this self-understanding, this self-awareness, this interpersonal relational ability to deal with people as one example. And so many of these CEOs and owners embodied those ideas. It was a language that was a sacred language, a secular language, but the sacred language can go much deeper than the secular language that they were offering. And I said, well, there was one high priest from Wharton, for example, who was talking about the courage to be yourself, right? We talked about it earlier, this idea of authenticity. And if you're authentic, people are naturally attracted to you because they want to be authentic themselves. Well, there was a Lutheran theologian in the 20th century named Paul Tillich, and he wrote this book called The Courage to Be. And it turned out to be a bestseller. And I encourage any of your listeners to pick it up. It's a short book. You can read it. It's called The Courage to Be, Paul Tillich. He's a Lutheran theologian. And it's all about overcoming your anxieties, whatever they are in life, to recognize your true self. And your true self comes to the forefront the most when you have a relationship with Christ, for us Christians. And how do you get there? And you have to work on it. You have to pray. But for some, this authenticity comes more naturally than others. And I brought this up to the professor after the session. I brought up that book that I had read, and he said, no, you're absolutely right. He goes, and he was familiar with the book. And he said, yeah, that's theological language for this secular description that I'm talking about. But the beauty of the theological language is that it goes deeper. It goes deeper into what it means to be human, truly human. And as a result, the idea of being authentic becomes more enduring, more lasting. And it's easier to operationalize it in your life, in your business as a leader. It's not just something you practice because you want to make your business better. It's not transactional. It is something much deeper that resonates deeper in your heart, in your soul, and therefore making it more enduring, and it shows up more unwittingly in your life as a leader. And that's where, the secular ideas and the sacred goes much deeper and brings out and expands on the secular leadership training. And that's what really drove me to want to study theology.
So what you're saying is that in general, like all of the secular leadership stuff, effectively in many ways draws its source from your word the sacred theology side of things, right? But they're kind of watering it down. But are you saying that in order to truly understand how to be a good leader and to take those things seriously, you have to understand the underlying reasons, the deeper reasons on the theology side of things?
I would say it helps. You don't have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And some people do it naturally. They're just natural leaders. I mean, you can teach people how to be a leader. You can try to teach people how to be a salesperson, but if they don't have it in them, they're not going to get there. So a lot of these leaders, it's really just, and this is interesting, and you make a good point. When you go to these leadership training courses, there's a lot of reasons why companies offer it. It's for retainage purposes, but it does help develop them for the future, for sure. But it gives them sort of validation of who they are. If they're not a great leader, it makes them a little bit better. If they are good leaders, it kind of validates who they are and gives them confidence. But if you're a religious person, the theological aspects of it goes deeper and gives you validation for who you are. And I used to run into executives, that would compartmentalize their life. They had their work, their job, their career, and then they had their faith tradition, Sunday, go to mass, whatever their tradition was. And the two were largely separate. You can't separate them completely, but if you think of like a Venn diagram, the overlap was not very much. But if they understand the secular ideas of leadership science in a theological sense, all of a sudden the Venn diagrams overlap much more. And it gives them validation and comfort of expressing and living their life of faith more fully in their career, in their job as a leader.
If busyness and admin work are keeping you from growing your business, it's time to call Paraclete VA. We connect Catholic business owners with elite Catholic virtual assistants worldwide to handle your marketing, finance, and busy work. How it works is you pay $500 on the day they start, and if you're still happy after 30 days, you pay another $500. Most roles take less than 10 days to fill. To get started, just email admin@catholicfounders.com with a little bit about what you're looking for so you can get back to doing what matters. That's interesting. I think the idea of separating it's very dangerous. I think to separate them because then you start to think that it's okay. We had Jeff Shufflebine on early on in the podcast to talk about this. He runs Undivided Life, which is all about that idea. Like you can't separate the two. So I think that's interesting. I would be curious to maybe dig a little deeper onto this one idea that in the business world, something I've been frustrated by when I see this and I hear other people talk about this is. There's all these best practices that people talk about. Oh, this is the best practice. This is that. There's all everybody's reading all the studies on how to do this and that. And a lot of them, in my opinion, have become a lot of these best practices are kind of contrary, either directly or indirectly, to being a true Catholic in like living out your faith and following Catholic social teaching. So I'm curious if is this something because you've been in the space, you saw a long career in this. Did this evolve over time to become more watered down because of the litigation culture, or is there underlying good things there, or do we really need to like rethink some of these things and bend them to the mold of our Catholic social teaching because it's the right thing, rather than the other way around, kind of like figuring out how to make them compatible?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think, look, we live in a society where it's like ever increasing secularization. So there's less value placed on overt religious beliefs and practices. It'd be great if we lived in a world where people could be more open about their faith and feel comfortable with it, especially if you're a public figure, like a CEO of a company. Of course, there are many that are, and you know many of them, but there are many that don't. And sometimes the things that require us to be a good Catholic are seen as weakness in the marketplace. And I think that's where the idea kind of gets distorted. This idea of humility in the business world, right? In my world, in investment banking, if you're humble or you show humility, it's a sign of weakness. You've got to be aggressive. You got to be always pushing the envelope and driving, for success. That's the image, but it's not true. Some of the great bankers that I worked with, the successful ones, were humble. And their clients, they said, this person's really smart. They have great ideas. I want to work with them. I trust them. And they also had a humility about them. And I think that's what helps build that trust. And there are others, of course, that are sort of just the opposite, and they might have success too. They have success in their own way. It's difficult. It depends on the individual. But I do think that in our culture, we have distorted the ideas of traditional morality in American culture. And somehow, we've veered from a lot of our religious roots. And how do we reclaim that? I'm a hopeful person.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely important that we recognize that all work and all business is in service of our lives, not the other way around. We're not born, we're not put into this world. God didn't put us here for the sake of working, right? The point of this world is to get to heaven and to know, love, and serve God. So we have to recognize that is the most important thing and put it back into the workplace. But to go back to what my question, maybe one more clear way I can articulate this is, let's put it in the case of letting somebody go or like firing somebody. I know that the best practice is to not say exactly why somebody is being fired or let go, because it opens the company up for litigation. But what really it is you talked about this earlier, like the humility of some of the bankers you met, a willingness to be corrected and to give correction in a charitable way is a very challenging thing because it requires confrontation. Patrick Lencioni has written about this a lot in his book, The Advantage, about like dealing with confrontation and conflict, but in a respectful and charitable way. And this is one example where I'm like, okay, this is so wrong to let somebody go. Maybe they've been in the job for a long time, and maybe it's really that, hey, like we just don't have the funding, or maybe there's something specific about that person's life that they could use that feedback at the very moment why they're being let go. But HR rules and best practices state, hey, don't say why, just like tell them they're being exited and they're going to get their package, and it's so on and so forth. Do you have any perspectives on things like that where we should say, you know what, just because it's best practice, no, we should do the right thing. We should treat the person as individual who is another human on the other side of this table.
Yeah. It's a tension, and you have to balance it. I worked for a corporation that had strict rules and HR guidelines and those kinds of situations. You're an employee of that company. You're obligated to follow the rules. You can break them if you want, but there are risks that go along with it. And how far am I willing to go to be more compassionate, more human towards the person? And many times I would cross the line. I felt comfortable doing it. I took a risk because I felt it was necessary. Look, HR, says I need to do this, but let me be honest with you. And, you trust them, they trust you, you feel comfortable explaining it to them. But it's a tension, and it depends on the individual situation. There are other times where I didn't want to go anywhere near crossing that line because I felt like I was exposing myself too much. So, yeah, I was thinking about myself and protecting myself, but also I've got an obligation to the organization to protect the organization, right? There's risk there. So it's not an easy answer, but, understanding that tension, I think, is where you start, and recognizing it. And then maybe in each situation, you can manage it a little bit differently as best you can.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I do think that it's possible to build cultures where you would always feel comfortable, quote unquote, crossing the HR's line, right? Because you've built a culture of openness. And, not every person is going to be open to this. But when you build a culture of like always giving feedback and taking it and helping people like recognize that it's not personal. I remember one of my when I first moved out to New York City, working in recruiting, I've all my insecurities that I was raised with, and I would get feedback from my boss, and I would get very defensive. I didn't even notice I was doing this. And he, like within a week or so, he's like, mate, I'm not trying to attack you. I'm trying to help you improve. And I just clicked with me and like pulled me out of myself. And if he hadn't done that, if he would have been like, I don't want to, deal with this, he might have just let me go. But he was like, no. I'm trying to help you understand how to get better at this job. And I'm not, these are critiques about your work, not about you as a person. And that was incredible. It really changed my life, honestly, that a willingness to kind of like shape me and form me. So I think we can build these cultures if we want to, but it is very hard. And I think that the tediousness of building these cultures is actually sometimes the hardest thing for entrepreneurs, because we love the grand, we love, in a way, a lot of entrepreneurs are kind of modern day conquerors, or at least that's kind of how they view themselves. Like, I'm going to achieve something, and the tediousness, dealing with paperwork is not exactly our favorite thing, right? So maybe something to consider. But we're running out of time, so I want to wrap up with some rapid fire, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah.
Are there any specific scriptures that really inspire you, especially from kind of a business or entrepreneurial standpoint?
So there's I think it's Psalm 46. Be still and know that I am. You can meditate on that in difficult times. Mm-hmm. Be still and know that I am. Like if your mind is racing at night, you're sleeping, you're worried about something at work, something bad happened, or you're tense about anxiety about something happening, be still and know that I am. It's powerful. There's one other one in Romans 12, chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, which is where the whole tone of the letter changes. You can argue that letter is the most important letter ever written in Western culture, Romans. It's a fascinating letter. But the first half of the letter is about sort of Paul's theology. You could describe it that way. But then the second part of the letter from 12 on really talks about how you live that in your daily life. And those first two sections begin with the word therefore. So it's like everything he said before that is now therefore, and it builds. And there's a lot more to that, obviously, but those are two that I find very helpful. I like that. The importance of living your faith.
Awesome. Who is an entrepreneur that really inspires you, and why?
Yeah, so, Elon Musk, for all his faults, and he's got plenty of them, his wonder, the wonder at life, the ability to imagine something beyond things that other people have imagined. We need more people in life that look at the world and say, oh my gosh, the wonder of life, the wonder of God's creation, the wonder of it, right? There's an optimism that goes along with it. We talked about the moral hazard that goes along with it, but he's one. The other one I would mention, because I mentioned him earlier, he's not an entrepreneur, but Jamie Dimon, I just find him he's the leader of probably the greatest bank in the world, but he's just a straight shooter, plain talking person. He's very honest and I believe authentic. And I always like it when he's in the press. I always read whether they're press releases or letters.
Nice. Maybe we'll get him to run for president one day. I think a lot of people are clamoring for that. I don't think he wants to do that, though. Who is one of your favorite saints and why?
So, well, today is the feast day of St. Ignatius Loyola, July 31st. He's always been, when I first really started to get into my faith more deeply and trying to explore it and understand it to enhance my faith, he was one of the first. I had an uncle who was a Jesuit priest, so of course he had an influence on me. But the thing I like about St. Ignatius Loyola, and I learned more about him studying at Boston College, being a Jesuit school, and being in classroom with Jesuits who were in formation to become priests. He was a leader. I mean, he had an outward spirituality. It was engagement with the world. How do we take the grace of God into the engagement with the world? We want to be out there, engaging with people, organizations, and bringing grace outside the monastery. He wasn't the first to do it, but he was the one that did it the way he did. And the other thing I'll say about him from a leadership perspective, great organizations have great mission statements, and his is for the greater glory of God. And the thing that's so great about it is it's so adjustable. For the greater glory, what are we doing? We can change what we're doing as long as it's for the greater glory of God. So it gives him that changeability to pursue different things. Like we think about the Jesuit mission of education. How many colleges and universities are there around the world? That was not part of their original mission. It was only when some people from Messina, Italy came to him and said, hey, we want a school. And he started the first school and it had great success that they found that mission. So again, that adaptability that goes with a great mission statement for the greater glory of God.
Mm-hmm. That is a pretty fascinating thing because I think that the why of a company is something I've been trying to think about, which is like when I started doing my recruiting business, I just viewed it as I'm a headhunter, right? I do these things. But in reality, the real mission and the real underlying reason why I continue to be in this space is because I want to see a very specific type of startup to succeed. Mm-hmm. And if that requires changing my product offering, then that's fine. I just have to recognize that the product itself is not what matters. The mission and how you serve that particular mission is what matters. So it's something I find very challenging in business because it seems easier when it's related to your faith and other things. But when there's a product being offered, it's like, okay, well, am I inconsistent for changing that? Like there's all these kind of like considerations you have as an entrepreneur. So I definitely resonate with that a lot. Like understanding how to put your finger on what it is that we do and why we're doing it. And then the rest of the things that go around that can kind of change to an extent.
Yeah, yeah.
What is one of your favorite...
Do you have a mission statement now?
I don't have like a mission statement, but our objective is to help clean technology startups be able to hire the best people and to do it affordably, basically. So whether that means I'm doing headhunting or just advising founders, I've started to realize that that's the thing that we care about. We care about these companies that I believe are going to push the frontier of technology forward, and it's going to be for the benefit of future generations. And I know that hiring the right people is going to be a large part of how they succeed at doing that, and I just want to help them do that.
Yeah, bringing great people to clean technology.
Yeah, exactly. I always shy away from mission statements. I just want it to be like, can somebody articulate it on their own? But I maybe should get clearer on it.
Well, that was my weak attempt in the moment.
No, it's good. It's good. So final one here for you. What's your favorite devotion and why?
Well, probably is the Rosary. I got involved in, after I graduated from BC, prison ministry. So I go into the prisons here in Rhode Island and I minister to the prisoners, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes in group settings. And a lot of times the prisoners want to recite the Rosary. And sometimes the prison guards, the corrections officers, they kind of hover, reluctant to join with the inmates at the same level. But some of the correctional officers are more courageous and they'll step in and get involved in the prayer. It's very powerful. Because the whole environment in the prison system is just sort of built on oppression, keeping the inmates in line, and the corrections officers can be pretty difficult to deal with. But once in a while, you'll get one or two that will actually join in. So anyway, that kind of, obviously I've always been aware of the Rosary, but seeing the prisoners and how important it is to them kind of made me more devoted to it. So now I say it every day.
Amazing. I like that. I like that perspective. It's the Rosary is something I grew up praying, and I think people can take it for granted. I certainly did. I've had recently a few people mention it to me again as their favorite devotion, and it's made me have, I guess you could say, renewed appreciation / resolve to do it better, right? I think it's something that with many things in our life, business, faith related, whatever, you can do them and then you just kind of get used to it. You're in a groove, and there's a benefit to having a routine and a groove, but there's also the danger of letting it become monotonous and letting it like forgetting the value of it, right? And forgetting the things that we're grateful for, right? I always think about how when I was younger, all I wanted to do was have a family and have basically the freedom to run my own business. And I have those things. And sometimes I forget about that I have them and I complain. And then I just take a moment to realize, like, you know what? I have everything I've ever asked for. I've got children, I've got a wife, I've got my own business, and I'm not on the streets. So God is very good, and we have to we have to remember the things that we cared about, they're right in front of us, So where can people reach you and learn more about what you're doing? Because I know you have a Substack.
I do have a Substack. It's called Workday Leader, so you can search for that. That's how I found you. I do a column or an article every Tuesday morning. It goes out around 7:30. It takes the readings from the Catholic lectionary, identifies a leadership lesson within the lectionary, and then it brings out a real modern contemporary case study, business or political, to show somebody that embodies the leadership traits that we see in the readings for the day. It's short. It's only about 500 words. There's also a link to the daily readings, so you can also link right to the readings if you want. So I have fun with that.
Yeah, I like that a lot. One thing I'll say is I think it's very valuable for people, if they don't already, to consider making sure that even if you can't attend daily mass, at the bare minimum, at least read the daily readings of the day, because then you can stay in rhythm with the rest of the church as you go throughout the season. So anyways, Joe, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. This was very, very enjoyable. I learned a lot from you, and looking forward to seeing how things continue to go with the work you're doing.
Thanks very much, Silas, for having me on. Appreciate it.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed this, please do share it with somebody who you think will find it really valuable. We always do appreciate a podcast review. If you're listening on any sort of Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you can leave stars and reviews and all that stuff. Again, people say this, but it genuinely does help us a lot, actually. And then I would encourage you, if there's something particular about this episode that kind of stuck out to you, take a notepad, write it down, and spend a little bit of time thinking about it. Usually the things that stand out to you as kind of like, ooh, that was interesting. It is the Holy Spirit trying to say something to you, right? That's at least my belief. And part of the reason I love the medium of podcasting is because you're not just focused on utility and trying to get the basic data. You're sitting there, enduring us talk for an hour about these things. And in some ways, that kind of prepares you to be open to receiving something. So if something stood out to you, think about it. Maybe it's the Holy Spirit calling you to a little bit of a deeper relationship with him and to changing something perhaps about how you run your business. Thank you again to Our Father Constructors and Associates for being a sponsor of this podcast. Go to them for any church-related construction projects that you might need done. If you want to get them done right, on time, and on budget, go to ourfather.us to learn more and tell them that Catholic Founders sent you. Thank you also to Monument Advisors, sophisticated wealth advisors for Catholic business owners who want access to all asset types. Go to monumentadvisors.com, monumentadvisors.com. And finally, if you're a Catholic business owner and you're looking to become one, consider joining the Catholic Founders Guild. I really mean this. I harp about this all the time on the podcast, but we want every Catholic entrepreneur to be involved in this. We have a growing group of about 180-ish Catholic entrepreneurs in there now who are exploring what it means to be a Catholic entrepreneur. They're understanding the theology of entrepreneurship, how to actually integrate, tactically speaking, the Catholic social teaching principles into what they do. We learn from each other, tactics about, how to grow our sales pipeline or how to do marketing and all these things. There's all this helpful stuff. And then there's a formation component about us understanding what it means and what we're called to be as entrepreneurs. It's about a lot more than just making money. We're here to provide for our own families, for the families who work for us, but also to just be an example to the culture around us, to start transforming our communities. This is about a lot more than business. It's about changing the culture. We're here trying to make America Catholic through entrepreneurship. So if you resonate with that in any way, consider joining the Guild. It's only $100 a year to join it. We're trying to keep it super affordable so that anybody can jump in. You can just go to join.catholicfounders.com to learn more. And if you're interested, you can subscribe there. And then myself or Oscar will be in touch with you to get you involved in the Guild. It really means a lot to us. Again, if you did find this valuable, share it with somebody else. But consider joining the Guild. That's the key thing. Join the Guild, guys. We're trying to build up the kingdom, and we can't do it alone. We really need to do this together. And the key thing is to grow local communities, not just some online community. The more people we get in every jurisdiction or every state or city, the more we can have more local connection. All right, thank you guys so much for tuning in. God bless you, and don't forget that entrepreneurship is a divine calling. Are you willing to answer that calling? All right, God bless.